London, September 1666. The greatest city in the English-speaking world is a smoldering ruin. 4/5 of the medieval heart of the city is gone, reduced to ash and rubble. Amidst the chaos and despair, a lone figure steps forward. His name is Robert Hubert, a simple French watchmaker, and he has a confession to make. He claims he, and he alone, started the fire that destroyed London. It was a deliberate act of arson. But was he a shadowy agent of a foreign power, the villain of our story? Or was he something else entirely, a convenient lie, a tragic scapegoat for a city desperate to blame anyone but itself? The story of the Great Fire of London is often told as a story of an accident, a tragic but blameless catastrophe. But to truly understand it, we have to look beyond the official narrative. We have to explore the tale of the supposed arsonist, because his story reveals a darker truth about the city itself, a city drowning in fear, paranoia, and a burning hatred for outsiders long before the first flame was ever lit. To understand the fire, you must first understand the city. The London of 1666 was not a city of stone and marble, but a city of wood and thatch. It was a medieval labyrinth of narrow, twisting alleys, where timber-framed houses leaned so close together you could shake hands from the windows above. Ominously, the city was built on centuries of its own waste, with cellars full of flammable goods, oil, pitch, tar, wine, and gunpowder left over from the English Civil War. It was a city that had just endured the horror of the Great Plague, a pestilence that had killed nearly a quarter of its population. The trauma was fresh, and the air was thick with suspicion. England was at war with the Dutch and the French. Whispers of Catholic plots and foreign spies were on every corner. This wasn't just a city, it was a tinderbox of wood and fear, waiting for a single, careless spark. And in the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, September 2nd, that spark arrived. The place was Pudding Lane, at the bakery of Thomas Farriner. He and his family were woken not by an alarm, but by smoke. Farriner swore that the fire in his oven had been extinguished, but a stray ember, a forgotten spark, had found its way to a pile of nearby fuel. The Farriner family scrambled to safety over the rooftops, but their maidservant, too frightened to make the jump, became the fire's first victim. Yet, when the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was finally roused to inspect the scene, he was infamously dismissive. "Pish," he supposedly scoffed. "A woman might piss it out." He went back to bed. It was perhaps the most disastrously wrong decision in London's history, because this was no ordinary fire. A fierce easterly wind had begun to blow. It fanned the flames from Pudding Lane and turned the small bakery fire into a hungry beast. The fire didn't just spread, it leaped. The wind carried blazing embers across streets, setting thatched roofs alight far ahead of the main blaze. The city's primitive firefighting methods, bucket chains and simple squirts, were useless. The standard procedure was to use fire hooks to pull down houses and create fire breaks, but the Lord Mayor hesitated, worried about the cost and who would pay for the demolished properties. By Sunday morning, London was in chaos. The diarist Samuel Pepys, a naval administrator, climbed the Tower of London to get a better view. He wrote in his diary of the lamentable fire and the miserable cry of the people. He rushed by coach to the palace at Whitehall to warn King Charles II directly. The king, unlike his mayor, understood the gravity of the situation immediately. He gave Pepys his authority to start pulling down any houses necessary. But by then, it was already too late. The wind had created a monster. The fire was now a firestorm, a self-sustaining inferno with its own weather system, sucking in oxygen and creating winds of incredible force. It melted the iron gates of the city and turned the stones of churches into rubble. The heat was so intense that the lead roof of St. Paul's Cathedral melted and flowed in a molten river down the streets. Panicked citizens fled, clogging the roads to the north and west, while others desperately tried to ferry their belongings across the River Thames on overloaded boats. The river itself seemed to be on fire, covered in burning debris. The city was experiencing a true apocalypse. For 4 days, the fire raged. And in its wake, as the smoke began to clear, the search for a cause began. It couldn't have been an accident, not a disaster of this scale. It had to be a plot. It had to be the Dutch, or the French, or the Catholics. The public's fear and anger needed a target. And then, as if on cue, they were given one. Robert Hubert, the French watchmaker, was arrested in Essex, trying to flee the country. Under interrogation, he confessed. His story was specific. He claimed to be a member of a gang of French arsonists. He said that he had used a fire grenade, a primitive incendiary device, and thrown it through the open window of the bakery on Pudding Lane. He even led his captors through the charred ruins of London to the exact spot where the bakery once stood. For many, this was proof enough. An eyewitness. A confession. The London Gazette reported it as fact. The fire was a horrid, malicious, and devilish plot. But the story had problems. Glaring problems. For one, Robert Hubert was severely disabled and lame. He couldn't have walked the long distance from Westminster to Pudding Lane as he claimed. More damningly, the captain of the ship that brought him to England testified that Hubert hadn't even landed in the country until 2 days after the fire had started. He was physically not in London when the blaze began. And perhaps most telling of all, Thomas Farriner, the baker, swore that his bakery had no windows. It was impossible for Hubert to have thrown anything inside. The man's confession was a fantasy. Yet, it was a fantasy the city desperately wanted to believe. Despite the contradictory evidence, despite the captain's testimony, despite the baker's certainty, Robert Hubert was put on trial. The judge himself noted the confession was likely extracted under duress, and that the man seemed mentally unwell. But the political pressure was immense. The jury found him guilty. On October 27, 1666, Robert Hubert was hanged at Tyburn. Even after his death, the story unraveled further. It was discovered he wasn't even Catholic, the group most feared, but a Protestant. He was simply the wrong man, in the wrong place, at the worst possible time. A sacrifice to a city's fury. As London began to sift through the ashes, the true scale of the devastation was biblical. Over 13,000 houses were gone. 87 of the city's 109 churches were destroyed. The magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral, a landmark for centuries, was a hollow shell. The official death toll was recorded as being in the single digits, a figure we now know is impossible. The poor and the unknown who perished in the flames were simply not counted. They were erased, first by the fire, and then by history. But from these ashes, a new city would rise. Led by visionaries like the architect Sir Christopher Wren, London was rebuilt with wider streets and houses made of brick and stone. The fire, in its destructive fury, had scoured the city clean of the plague-infested slums. A monument was erected near Pudding Lane to commemorate the disaster. For over 150 years, it bore an inscription blaming the fire on a Catholic conspiracy, a permanent stain of the paranoia that had cost Robert Hubert his life. It was only removed in 1830. The Great Fire of London was almost certainly an accident, born of negligence in a city built to burn. But the story of Robert Hubert, the arsonist, serves as a chilling reminder. It shows us how quickly fear can curdle into blame, and how a society under pressure can sacrifice an innocent life for a comforting lie. It's a story not just of fire and stone, but of the darkness that can ignite within the human heart in a time of crisis.